Well, hello everybody. Is this the mahogany room? Is that right? All right. All right. I think I've got a small handful of attendees, but we're live streaming this too, right? All right. So you've also got people attending virtually at this time? Okay. Great. Well, for those of you who have decided to stick it out for this session, I appreciate your attending. Nice to see a few folks here. So my name is Sean Ferguson. Oh, excuse me. Just going to make sure I've got my clicker here. So my name is Sean Ferguson. I'm a program officer at the National Endowment for the Humanities in the Division of Preservation and Access. So we're a federal agency that gives grants on topics relating to the humanities, but the department I come from specifically focuses on all of the preservation and access work that archivists tend to do, as well as museums and libraries and other cultural heritage organizations. So for this session, we are going to start, and this is just a bit of a brief agenda for what we're going to cover. We're going to start with an introduction to NEH. I'm going to talk a little bit about what this federal agency does, and then I will talk about what the program for, this grant program that I'm focused on for this presentation funds, all the different types of funding activities that you can do through the Preservation Assistance Grant for smaller institutions. Then I'll cover a few case studies. I'm going to move around this agenda just a tiny bit and make sure that we have time to do this little breakout activity where I would love to hear some thoughts of participants in the room or virtually, different types of preservation activities they might consider pursuing through the Preservation Assistance Grant. Then I'll just cover a few application logistics to keep in mind should you be interested in applying to this program. But without further ado, I'm going to get started just on what NEH is, what we fund, what our mission is. So we're a federal agency that was founded in 1965. Fun fact, we were founded in part to help compete with the Soviet Union during the Cold War, alongside our sister agency, the National Endowment for the Arts. We fund project-based activities competitively based on the quality of those projects in every aspect of the humanities, in any way that you could probably think that you might be involved in the humanities, whether that be in research that might lead to a publication of a book or a documentary. We've even funded a few humanities-focused video games. But of course, the thing that I'm here to talk about most is the work of preserving and providing access to collections. I also like to briefly just highlight the definition of what the humanities are, because it's a word that gets thrown around a lot. It has a lot of different subjects under its umbrella. Fortunately for NEH, the legislation that Congress passed defined the humanities for us. And so this is what we think of when we think of the humanities, which includes subjects like history, of course, the big one, but also language, literature. The preservation of endangered languages is something we're very involved in. And then while we don't create or we don't fund the creation of art, we fund interpretation and the preservation of artistic works. And then there are a wide array of other types of subject matter that we get involved in that you might be a little less engaged in your everyday work. Things like jurisprudence or comparative religion, but they are absolutely things that we fund and support within our federal agency's wheelhouse. Now that I've covered what NEH does, I really want to focus on this preservation assistance grant for smaller institutions and how your organization might benefit from it. Sort of a 101 on what the Preservation Assistance Grant is. We offer it annually. At this time, we're offering it in January. That's when the deadline is. And it's a program that helps small and mid-sized organizations improve their preservation practices over time. It is a program that applicants can apply to multiple times. They can receive awards multiple times. And the program is very cognizant of the fact that, especially for small and mid-sized organizations, the progress that they make in improving their preservation practices can often be very incremental. And in the best case scenario, it is often guided by some kind of assessment and formal plan that they've created with a consultant. And so this program funds consulting activities, assessment activities, and then things that have real tangible benefits for those organizations as well in the preservation sphere. So storage supplies, furniture, environmental monitoring equipment and software. I'll cover those in a bit more detail, but those are the types of things that this program will support for a small organization with a maximum funding amount of $10,000, completely outright. There is no matching requirement. I do want to cover, though, a few eligibility requirements to keep in mind. And so I'm just traveling over to this slide. Now, this slide's got a lot of info on it, but to summarize it, an organization that is eligible is one that is either a 501c3 nonprofit, an institution of higher education, or a state and local government and one of their departments or agencies. You got your public libraries or your county archives, fully eligible, clerk's offices, fully eligible, and of course, Native American tribes that are federally recognized. We see a lot of applications from those organizations as well. We don't fund private individuals or for-profit organizations or foreign entities. There's other additional eligibility requirements, which may sound a little daunting that we've imposed some extra ones, but I swear they are rather simple and easy to get through. The first one is that you've got to be the organization that is applying has to be the organization that is responsible for the care or custody or stewardship of the materials they want to benefit through the project. The other is that they have to have at least the equivalent of one full-time staff member. But what does that mean? That means that they're basically, whether they've got volunteers or they've got part-time staff or maybe full-time staff, that their organization is basically having about like 40 hours a week being put to the work of the organization, wherever that work may come from. And we are not restrictive. So volunteer work put to that time, board member work put to that time, all absolutely counts. And then we also like to see organizations that are able to make their collections open to the public for programming or research or educational opportunities, what have you. This is really so that, we're not funding an organization that would only ever make their collections accessible to internal staff within an organization. But one thing that I want to really highlight here, a major caveat, of course, and I think we just heard it in an earlier session, tribal organizations tend to have important culturally specific access protocols to their collections that may restrict access to some materials, and that is never a challenge for applying to this program. That is a fully accepted practice and doesn't count against that eligibility criteria. I want to highlight a couple of other FAQs and reminders, things that we often get asked. What does it mean to be a small or mid-sized organization if that's what this program is for? We rely on the applicant to define that. And for some organizations that may be a large university and you're like an archive or a special collections within the university's library, you likely still count in that regard. You have to just think about yourself in terms of your departmental unit. And so we allow organizations to represent themselves in the way that makes the most sense. A historical society might count their whole organization when they're thinking of what small and mid-size means, but a university and their archives might think about just their archival department. People often ask what other kinds of projects have been funded through the PEG or the Preservation Assistance Grant. On our website, we have a full list of every single organization that has ever received funding. We've even done blog posts of a variety of these recipients. And then the last thing, because I did mention that a lot of this program involves engaging consultants, people often wonder, where can I find a consultant? And while we cannot recommend a specific consultant for an organization, when they call us up, we can't point to a specific firm or private individual. We do have this whole list in Section H of our Notice of Funding Opportunity, which is our guidelines, that sort of helps you find those professionals. And the individual you pick for your consultation never has to be from that list, but it's often a helpful place to start for organizations who may not know right away where they can get a conservator or a preservation specialist to connect to their project. Now, I do want to cover some things that are just simply not funded through this program. We do fund a lot of different preservation activities, but we do not at this time fund digitization, which I know is the most requested activity. But in fact, we actually have different programs like the Humanities Collections and Reference Resources Program that funds digitization work. So that helps organizations who are interested in doing digitization. It's just not within this program. We also don't fund cataloging or describing or processing collections to make them accessible. This is another popular activity, but again, the Humanities Collections and Reference Resources Program funds all that work that really brings collections out and available to the public. We're very focused on the preservation side. We also get a lot of requests for preserving historic buildings and structures. We just don't do historic preservation work in this program. And that's something that NEH in general doesn't quite fund. The National Park Service is a better pick for that if you're looking for federal funding. Some simple ones: attendance at conferences is not eligible, nor is buying display cases that are exclusively for rotating exhibits. If the item is going to be in the display case for eternity, then you can buy the display case, which I know is a funny distinction, but we're very focused on storage furniture, which is why we have that distinction. The one that I neglected to mention here, but I think was on another slide, we can't fund conservation treatment either, unfortunately. So repair of historical materials, that is something that this program doesn't support. However, I hope through the next few slides, I highlight many, many things that you actually can support through this program. So the most popular thing, the first thing organizations tend to request is to get a general preservation assessment funded through this program. This is the entryway to this entryway grant, where an organization applies and they have identified a consultant who's going to come in and do a site visit. Maybe it's one day, maybe it's a few days, and they talk to all the different stakeholders in your organization, whether that's the president of the historical society or the dean of your library. They're basically trying to look for ways to chart out a roadmap for improving preservation practices for your organization into the future. They're looking for how collections are stored. They're looking for how the building is doing a good job or not a good job of preserving collections. They're looking at how your policies manage the collection effectively for both use and care. Now, this type of assessment results in a report that serves as a roadmap for like 5 to 10 years of preservation activities. And this is, again, the real start of an organization's journey through this program, the Preservation Assistance Grant Program. However, I will say that if you've already received some kind of assessment that resulted in a report that guides your organization's preservation practices, you don't have to get it again if it's very recent and you want to move on to more activity-related work, not just strategic planning work. But this is where we see a lot of organizations start when they have not done that already. After that, receiving that consultation or that assessment, a lot of organizations pursue a variety of advanced consultations. Advanced consultations might dive deeper into specific subject matter that might be not fully explored or may have only been explored at a surface level through the general preservation assessment. Very popular topics in this regard include, while we cannot do the conservation treatment work, maybe the preservation specialist has said, I've observed some very important collections that are in dire need of potential treatment, and you can bring a conservator to do an assessment of those materials to create a treatment plan. And then that gets you halfway there towards getting the real treatment done. But very, very popular. We do see a lot of environmental monitoring consultations that help you launch an environmental monitoring program. We also see advanced consultations that go in and assess the HVAC system, the building and mechanical systems that support preservation of the collections. We also see organizations looking for ways to passively improve the environment. So not spending energy to enhance the effectiveness of the HVAC, but rather looking for ways to insulate a building more effectively so that it holds the environment and doesn't sort of release air too easily, and then the temperature and relative humidity are harder to control with the HVAC system. Light mitigation or perhaps security. There's all sorts of specific types of advanced consultations that can be pursued through the Preservation Assistance Grant. I will say at the end, I'm going to touch on some of these in more detail in a couple of slides, but everything that I've talked about so far has really been about the physical preservation of physical collections, but digital preservation is also fully addressed through this program. A lot of organizations see that as sort of an advanced consultation that they pursue once they feel as though they have a good grip on their physical materials. In terms of supplies and furniture, though, which is an extremely popular category of funding for this program, whatever's been recommended in an assessment or a consultant can really vouch for and say, yes, this is what the organization needs to improve their preservation practices. You can order, if you can fit in your grant in those $10,000, compact shelving. We've seen compact shelving requested. We've seen art rack storage requested. Flat file drawers are incredibly popular for oversized materials. We see that. We also see, though, the storage enclosures that accompany that furniture. So large folders or flip top boxes, drop front boxes. Another very common one is custom enclosures for bound volumes, all sorts of different ways to properly store your materials. And we can also support discrete units that help to control the environment, especially if you've got a good understanding of what your environment is in your space. The one thing I've got to warn you against, it can't be like the piece of an HVAC system, a whole system. It's got to be like something that sits on the ground and is maybe hanging out the window or something like that. It's got to be a standalone unit. HEPA filter vacuums also count within this category. And then, like I said, environmental monitoring is extremely popular. This is perhaps the thing that people go to most often after getting an assessment, where they're looking for maybe perhaps the most bang for your buck in terms of improving your preservation practices. It goes down to improving the preservation environment, and you have to know what the environment is before you can control it. And so acquiring data loggers and different kinds of software that might help to interpret that data, maybe even assign specific numbers that outline the preservation outlook for materials, all of that is eligible. And a lot of organizations tend to pair this with a consultation with somebody who's very experienced in setting up these programs to advance your environmental monitoring program in a really thoughtful way that directly correlates to the needs of your collections. Like I said, digital preservation and storage are also things that we see applicants come in for. Digital preservation assessments have been eligible for a long time. And this is really perfect for organizations who have maybe done a lot of digitization work. They've digitized a lot of collections, but maybe they haven't stopped to get a preservation assessment of what the quality of the storage conditions are for those materials. Do they have independent, redundant independent copies of their files geographically distributed? Are they working with high quality digital preservation storage vendors? Are things in the cloud? Are things on site? How do you engage with IT? A lot of the general preservation assessment work ends up being discussions with facilities staff who are in charge of managing the environment. In the digital preservation assessments, a lot of the conversations end up being with IT who are in charge of managing the digital environment. But of course, as we know, IT staff tend to think very specifically about how files should be managed for a business use case. And they don't always have the digital preservation knowledge that a digital preservation specialist might be able to introduce to your program. So any organization that's gone through an assessment can also start to think about digital preservation storage, which is new as of last year. This could be external hard drives or NAS, if that's something that's appropriate for your university, even LTO tape. So all sorts of different discrete digital storage units can be acquired through this program. But I will say that this is one of those things that can be a little challenging to deploy if you don't have a lot of experience managing digital preservation storage, even after getting a consultation. So we do see some organizations also bring in a consultant to do a training on digital preservation storage, or even walk them through the implementation of that storage option as well. Then we got emergency preparedness. So this can go from writing your very first disaster plan, doing, let's see, I think receiving a risk assessment could be an eligible activity if that's something that feels really relevant to the needs of your organization and we're not sufficiently covered in a general preservation assessment, or disaster supply kits. Those seem to be very, very popular. So building out multiple disaster supply and recovery kits that might include tarp, newspaper, print, or blotting paper, all of that is fully eligible in this program and can be pursued. And lastly, training. A lot of organizations need to build skills, whether that be through registering for a webinar or bringing a consultant to host a workshop. All of these funding opportunities, or excuse me, these workshop opportunities should really be ideally built off of what's found in an assessment or clearly articulated as part of what your plan is for improving the preservation practices of your organization. Now, they can include access topics, whereas all the other work has been pretty solely focused on preservation of collections. This right here can also include learning how to process collections more effectively, learning how to digitize collections more effectively. So the training can be more permissive than, say, the other different types of eligible activities that are allowed in this program. And then if you're hosting that workshop on site, we strongly encourage that the applicant makes that workshop available to neighboring organizations, because then it spreads the knowledge and I would say allows for us to say that we're getting more bang for our buck when we fund a training in one organization. And then many organizations mix and match all these activities. And so I just described a bunch of discrete eligible activities, but you can say if you've had a general preservation assessment that said you needed new storage, new disaster recovery supplies, maybe a consultation or a workshop on a specific topic, you can pull all those together in a single application. The one thing that's important to keep in mind logistically for an application for an organization who has never received a general preservation assessment before, they absolutely must have a letter of commitment from the person giving the assessment that specifically says, I've talked already to the organization and can say that they need these storage supplies. Having that consultant back up that request is a specific requirement in the program. Those can change based off what the site visit sort of discovers. However, an initial list based on consultation is required when you haven't had that assessment yet. A classic example might be getting a general preservation assessment, and then your consultant can tell, like, there's a bunch of glass plate negatives here, they're all in their original enclosures, and we need to replace those. And then sort of spelling out a list of materials that might go with the assessment. Oh, I will say quickly, if you're going for custom enclosures, custom measured enclosures, that's one of the best, I think, opportunities to pair that with a training, because I've done it before. I think that measuring boxes for books can be a little harder than you expect. And so getting some training on a subject like that might enhance the viability of your application. Very much like when you get data loggers for environmental monitoring and you've never had an environmental monitoring program, a workshop can be helpful there. We also do have a very special encouragement for organizations who have been in a federally declared disaster area. Most organizations who have been in that type of disaster know that they have been in that disaster, but I would say for a lot of now me, I lived in the Northeast. We had terrible snowstorms, and I assumed, like I just lived through them. But many organizations went through serious burst pipes in their basements that led to flooding, that led to those collections being sent to Belfour or BMS CAT or some organization to freeze them. And then they come back and they're not really usable. And they're thinking, well, who can I get funding for? Well, turns out some of those snowstorms end up being federally declared disasters. And so you can check out FEMA's website and see if that perhaps a seasonal event in your area ended up being a federally declared disaster. It could make you eligible for this type of activity, which includes the disaster recovery of sending them to a vendor to freeze them, but also conservation treatment to repair those materials once they're brought back to you. We also fund temporary storage and relocation, a wide variety of things that are specifically meant for organizations who are trying to make collections accessible and preserve them after they've been damaged or destroyed in a federal disaster. This is actually the only opportunity we have right now for if you need your collections digitized. Say you've got photos in a photo album that are not coming out because the emulsion layer is stuck to the plastic surface, or VHS tapes that really ought to be digitized as soon as they're cleaned. Maybe they've got mud and gunk inside them. Those could be allowed for digitization as a preservation methodology. So this is a review slide of all of those different activities, and I'm going to hold this up when we do our little breakout activity, but I would like to highlight just 4 quick case studies of organizations largely from the Intermountain region who have received this funding and done really good work with it and sort of charted out a productive course for improving their preservation practices. The first is the University of New Mexico Maxwell Museum of Anthropology Archives. This project was one that was based on a general preservation assessment. They actually got a CAP assessment, which is facilitated by FAIC, Foundation for Advancement and Conservation. And that gave them the knowledge they needed to say, hey, we've got this photographic collection that is all in its original enclosures from a photographer and anthropologist who documented various different communities' lives, whether it be Nova Scotia farmers and fishermen to Native American tribes. But all these photos were in terrible shape. And so they needed drop front boxes, polypropylene sleeves, box albums, and then they also needed staff time to do that rehousing. And so this program allows for requesting staff time when it's related to the project at hand, because we understand that preservation work often doesn't get the staff support that it needs. Moving on to a different program or a different project here. Example 2 is from the Heard Museum, Billie Jane Bagley Library and Archives in Arizona. This is a classic general preservation assessment, 2-day site visit for an archive that is rich in photographic and audiovisual material and print material related to a variety of Native American tribes. This assessment covered 3 main areas: collections condition or materials, how are they stored, what is the status of those objects, and what needs to be done to improve their preservation outlook, as well as what the facilities are doing to manage the preservation environment, and then administration, which in this case counted for the intellectual control over the materials, the collection management policies guiding those materials. And this assessment guided this organization in developing a multi-phase plan over a number of years that included some urgent activities that were sort of low cost, immediate, and important to do, such as lowering the temperature in their library or lowering light levels in storage areas with windows. But then they identified some other projects that required further grant funding. For example, compact shelving that was simply too large and vast for them to request through the Preservation Assistance Grant. And so definitely identified the next steps for this organization. For example, too, I've got the county of Mojave, Arizona, a county that is home to multiple Native American tribes, ghost towns, important geographic features, like, of course, the Grand Canyon and the Mojave Desert. This organization had already gotten an assessment and realized they needed an advanced consultation in how to plan for improved storage in their space. This was a county which had several departments that all had cumulatively 1,200 linear feet of archival material stored in many different departments. And so they were able to bring a consultant in to say, this is what we need to do. These are the steps we need to take to help develop a plan to co-locate all of those disparate materials into one space. I didn't mention it before, but this is a great example of storage planning being achieved through an advanced consultation. And they factored in some preventive conservation training to improve the abilities of staff on site, and also data loggers and training on that subject to help them launch their environmental monitoring program, which informed the placement of materials after they did their storage planning. Lastly, this is a Midwest example, but one that I like to highlight for digital preservation storage. This is an organization, the Chicago Film Archives, which specializes in a lot of rare and unique Midwest film and video, both analog and born digital, but they have about 20 terabytes of digital material, and they did not have a collection management policy. They'd never had an assessment before. This advanced consultation guided them through the process of creating their first collection management policy, and also empowered them to select a vendor to get secure, offline, geographically distributed, and in fact, environmentally conscious digital preservation storage for a complete copy of their records. And so this is the type of thing that the assistance grant can make possible in the digital sphere. And so at this point, we actually, I said break up into groups of 5. There are 5 of you in this room, and you're also a little dispersed. But if you'd like to take a moment to gather a little bit and just talk about some of your preservation goals, or if you're in the realm of field services or consulting, thinking about some of the things that maybe the organizations you work with might need, I'd love it if you could think a little bit about what the next step would be in preservation for your organization, and if you could tie it to one of those eligible activities within this program. And I'll give us about 5 minutes to do that, if you all wouldn't mind maybe moving together a little bit. Okay, for those of you who are sitting online, I'm going to move back to the list in the earlier slide, which will serve as a reference point. And then please just take a moment to process for yourself, and then please share in the chat when I reconvene everybody to share a project idea, and we'll call them out and make sure that they're heard. We're going to do another maybe 5 minutes. Okay, thanks everybody for engaging in some interesting conversations, I hope. And thanks everybody who's been hanging on online. I was wondering if any folks would be interested in sharing perhaps a preservation project or something that they discussed in a small group. Happy to take any volunteers at this time.
So I was just telling this group about, well, in 2020, we had a 5.3 earthquake in Salt Lake City, and it required us to move out all of our collections into a new facility. And like we have like a basic building emergency preparedness plan, but we don't have a collections one, like that's just kind of like low hanging fruit that we could work on. And then also digital preservation assessment for sure. We've done our own like physical preservation assessments for the most part. I think we're good there. So like the digital would be the next step. And then I'm also here just because I work with field services and just getting ideas for other like local, smaller historical societies and museums of how I can pass along this information to them.
Oh, well, good. I'm glad that it's been helpful. And I do think some organizations that are a little bit more advanced on the physical preservation side, those are the types of organizations that start to think, maybe I'll do some digital preservation assessment now. Like many organizations are at that point.
Yeah, for sure.
Thank you. Anything from the
Okay, so online, Jaime Venezuela asks, is it more important to have a large single unifying project saying, I need preservation supplies for our College of Law alumni portrait collection, or could it be multiple projects? Preservation supplies for the portrait collection and preservation furniture for alumni gifts, Lady of Justice statue. So is it best to unify each project request in the narrative or just pick one over another?
That's a great question about how you frame and shape a compelling narrative. I will say that when you focus on a single collection, it can make the case for its importance easier to make because everything in the narrative is pointing towards that single project. However, I will say that if there is room in the budget and all of those discrete projects appear important to your organization and you think you can fit within the 5-page limit, a case for all of their significance, it could be a very worthy project to combine those discrete, disparate preservation activities, especially if they are like quote unquote unified under a large preservation plan that's guiding these priorities. And it just so happens it's time to deal with those 3 different collections. So by no means should you feel like you can't tackle 3 things if it fits within your time, your budget, and the work plan.
So he had one other question, just for clarification, a display case for a single non-rotating item or exhibit would be eligible.
Yes, display case for non-rotating materials. If that's their permanent location is in the display case, it's an eligible thing.
That's all I've got so far online.
Okay. Oh, that's fine.
I have a question for you.
Sure.
So let's say we got a grant 10 years ago. I was just looking it up for the general preservation assessment.
Yeah.
Would I need to do a new assessment because it's been a decade?
Oh, it's so while there is no hard cutoff for when an assessment stops being relevant, I would say assessments, it's generally best practice to do them every 5 to 10 years. And so you're around that edge, and it'll really factor into competitiveness where sometimes reviewers might say, and we can never predict what our reviewers will say, but they could wonder how relevant are these findings? What have they done since then? Have collections moved? Have preservation practices changed in 10 years? All those questions start to come up when you start getting in that 10-year mark. So I hope that's helpful.
Yeah. Plus new things have come in.
Yes.
Yeah.
Very well said. If those are the only comments and questions, I would be happy to move on to some just application logistics to be aware of. I think I'll also request to just commandeer the chat box at 1 second at the end to maybe put in a link to the program so you have easy access to that. But I'll move forward and just cover those logistics and then just open the floor to questions for the remaining time.
So I did have one more that just popped up.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. So she said, I once did a preservation consultation for a small tribal library for a newspaper collection. when they had no budget, which included summary housing. This sounds like something the grant would have been perfect for.
Oh, that's wonderful to hear. And yes, it absolutely would have been an eligible activity that we'd like to see come in. Okay. Well, they can come in and we'll cover them at the end. I just want to highlight a few extra points here. Review criteria. So these are the three things we look at, or our reviewers look at, when they're evaluating whether an application is one that we should recommend for funding. The first is the significance of the humanities collections and their use in education or research or public programming. And this boils down to some, hard numbers like, well, how often are the collections visited? How many visitors do you get to your exhibits, or how many people go into your research room? Or has anybody published anything based on the research they've done with the collections? None of it is like, it isn't a requirement that you do all three of those things. But the more you can point to, the better the case will be. There is no hard cutoff on what makes a collection significant to the humanities or not. And so really this review criteria is up to the quality of the case that you can make. We recommend that every organization, from a university to a historical society, try to connect their collections to important national themes of history and other subject matter. And so again, no specific cutoff, but where I would think would be the way you would want to go is, what compelling case can we write into that narrative for why these matter, and what themes can we connect these materials to? What questions can be answered about history or a different subject with those collections? And giving some hard numbers on how often they're used or accessed can be useful. The strength of the proposed activities, that second activity or second review criteria, is really about the quality of the project. For something like a general preservation assessment, that's a pretty easy thing to judge. But when we're talking about rehousing or integrating multiple different project activities into a single application, having a thoughtful work plan that chronologically outlines when things will be done with clear deliverables, like 25% of the collection will be rehoused, 50% of the collection will be rehoused at this point. That can give reviewers faith that the project will succeed in the period of performance that the applicant chooses. And lastly, the appropriate qualifications of the consultant and staff. If you don't feel like you have the internal qualifications to do the type of work you want to do, bringing in a consultant to guide you is always a good move. But one thing that we often see, a very common pitfall, is organizations that bring in a consultant to do preservation assessments of materials that maybe they don't have a background in. So we're often looking for match, or the reviewers are looking for match of the consultant to the materials, that they have a proven track record of doing preservation work with those formats. These are what I would like to highlight as our encouragements. We have a variety of encouragements to this program, and encouragements don't factor into the review criteria that you just saw. Everybody is treated based off of the quality of their proposal. But this is a list of different types of organizations that we would really like to see come into this program. Organizations that have never seen or never received an NEH award before, organizations like community colleges or minority serving institutions such as HSIs or HBCUs, of course, tribal organizations and collections, or organizations that manage collections related to Native Alaskan or Hawaiian indigenous materials. And lastly, too, any organization that feels as though that they have collections that represent people who have been underrepresented in the historical record. We would like to see more of those applications come in. These are all the components in the 5-page narrative that is submitted, and we do like to see applicants answer this almost like a questionnaire. And so 5 pages is not too long, but I suppose I could agree with you that maybe 7 questions, or 8 if you're doing federal disaster recovery work, it can be demanding, but I promise these are not the most challenging of questions to answer. And in our notice of funding opportunity, our guidelines, we have specific questions to answer within each of these questions. So you're really filling out a guided narrative list of prompts. And the organizations that tend to do well in this program are organizations that know how to answer these questions very clearly. Obviously, specifically, what activity are you pursuing? That's one of the easiest, the clearest ones. But when it comes to the content and size of the humanities collections, I will highlight that organizations who give very clear numbers, whether that be linear feet of archival records or a quantifiable a number of audiovisual items or photographic materials. That can help individuals, reviewers, get a better sense of the scope of the materials at hand. How are the collections used? Again, very specific here. If you can talk about how many exhibits the collections have been integrated into, the names of those exhibits, that's important to include here, or the number of research visits you get. What is the nature and mission of your institution or institutional unit? This is where you can talk about both, of course, your mission statement, but also how many staff you have. What is the departmental budget? You might also include in this section how many hours you're open to the public. I have seen reviewers get a little persnickety wanting to see exactly what your hours are, or if the collections are available by appointment. So highlighting different ways collections can be accessed can be very important in that section. Number 5 is really to give us a sense of whether you've had an assessment in the past, which can, of course, factor into whether this is the right time for you to be pursuing a specific project. Number 6, the importance of this project to your organization. Is your case or your chance to make the case for the value of this work to your organization, and why it is the right time to get an assessment or to improve your storage furniture or to monitor the environment. And then lastly, 7 is sort of a narrative little description of the staff and the consultants who are involved, and this complements the resumes that you include in the application as well. Number 8, there is some additional information to include should you be in a federally declared disaster area, and more details can be found in our guidelines about those questions. For the application submission process, the next deadline is anticipated to be January 12, 2024 at the minute before midnight. And I can tell you, we get plenty of applications in at 11:58 p.m. Always best to submit at least 1 hour before, though. I definitely encourage that. There is one problem, I would say, with applying to federal grants. You have to register with sam.gov, and then you have to register with grants.gov. It's all free, but it is a little annoying, and it does take a little bit of time. You have a ton of lead time right now. I mean, it is May for a January deadline, but if you're interested in applying to this program, making sure you register with SAM, you get your unique entity identifier, and then you register with grants.gov as soon as possible is always a good idea. We need those things to be current and active registrations in order to process your application. And then now they've added another feature to make things, I guess, easier. You have to log in through login.gov. So if you have a registration with grants.gov and sam.gov and you haven't logged in a while, you're going to need to log into another system to sort of unify all of those discrete registrations you have through login.gov. All of this is detailed in our notice of funding opportunity, but it's something I like to highlight. Very lastly, I just want to remind people that the way these applications are reviewed is that your peers review them. There may be somebody online or somebody in this room or somebody in the other room who has served as a peer reviewer for this program. And so once we get applications and we sort them into panels, we recruit panelists, these reviewers from your peers who are qualified to speak on those review criteria for those specific kinds of materials in that panel. And then once those outside experts have had their chance to voice their opinion, staff like myself sort of look at the funding scenario and we say, okay, I think these ones are going to get recommended. And then this group called the National Council on the Humanities reviews them. They're presidentially appointed, approved by the Senate. And then the chair of the agency approves them. And so that's the whole review process. I will say, while it may sound very official and very daunting, our last funding cycle did have a funding ratio of just above 50%. And so that is an inviting ratio for applications. And this is really to emphasize the way that, like, these aren't just people in an ivory tower reviewing these collections. These are people out in the field already doing this work, already working in organizations. Now, with that, I would like to thank you all for attending, whether it be in person or online. I hope you found this helpful. I do appreciate your attendance quite a bit, and I'm very happy to be here. If you got any questions, whether they be in person or on chat, I'm happy to stick around to answer them. Okay, well, if there are no questions at this time, give us a ring or send me an email, but thanks a lot for being a great audience.